Hi everyone, I'm Marloes Mak and I work at Radboud University Nijmegen. And today I would like to tell you a bit about how we can measure a process such as mental simulation during literary reading with methods like eye tracking. And to illustrate that, I will report one eye tracking study I did and a combined fMRI and eye tracking study. In my work, I try to look at simulation the way Barcelou defined it as the reenactment of perceptual, motor, and introspective states acquired during experience with the world, body, and mind. And the important thing to notice here is not only that simulation is a reenactment of our daily life experiences, but also that simulation is not necessarily one of a kind. It can be seen as perceptual simulation, motor simulation, and the simulation of introspective states. So we can also expect that these different kinds of simulation might behave a little bit differently. But importantly, simulation has been found to be closely related to language processing, or at least play a role in language processing, both on the behavioral and the neural level. And what we see is, for example, if we look at the simulation of introspective states, that when people are reading stories about characters that behave in a certain way that is congruent or incongruent with their personality, for example, we can measure that with the eye movements, or we can register that with the eye movements. Because when characters behave in a way that is incongruent with their personality, we make more regressive eye movements. So we are surprised about that because we are inferring what they would do based on their personality. And if they behave differently, we think, hey, this is weird, and we make a regressive eye movement. One example of how simulation can be measured in the behavior. And on a neural level, we see that perceptual simulation, motor simulation, and simulation of introspective states are all associated with modality-specific brain activation in areas, for example, involved in motor action or perception. I wanted to know, okay, can we differentiate between these three kinds of simulation using eye tracking? And can we at least measure simulation using eye tracking? And what I did was I asked participants to read 3 literary short stories. And I wanted to look at those parts of the stories that should be triggering simulation. From the eye tracking data, I had gaze durations per word, and I also asked a different set of participants to rate the stories. And what I asked them to do was to highlight the parts of the stories that they thought were part of motor descriptions, perceptual descriptions, or mental event descriptions. And my assumption here was that these descriptive passages in texts will be the place where people start to simulate. In my analysis, I regressed these ratings onto the gaze durations, controlling for lexical frequency, word length, survival value, and adding some random slopes. And what I found was, if we look at motor descriptions, that words that were more highly rated for being part of a motor description were associated with shorter gaze durations, which means that motor descriptions are read relatively fast. And we saw the reverse for perceptual descriptions. So words that were highly rated for being a perceptual description were relatively slow, were longer gaze durations to those words. The same can be said about mental event descriptions. People would read slower when encountering mental event descriptions, but we also see that this is a bit story specific here. And we also see some individual variation where actually quite some participants did not slow down but speed up when encountering mental event descriptions. But on average, we saw that action speeds up reading, perception and mental events slow down reading. So that is very interesting, but we are talking about descriptive language, and the assumption we made was that descriptive language elicits mental simulation, but we are not completely sure about that. So how can we know if these results we found with our eye tracking study can be interpreted as simulation? What do these changes in gaze duration mean? Was our question in terms of what happens in the brain. Because we had seen from the literature that different kinds of simulation were also associated with, for example, modality-specific brain activity. So if these motor descriptions elicit motor simulation, then these motor descriptions should also be associated with activity in the motor cortex, etc. Another possibility that we thought of was that there was no difference between these three kinds of simulation in the brain, but that there was just one shared brain area, and that is specific to mental simulation. And a option for such an area that has been identified in the literature is, for example, the posterior and anterior cingulate cortex or the angular gyrus. These are areas that are involved in situation model building, and it could be argued that simulation is a part of situation model building, or perhaps the way in which situation models are built. What we did was we repeated the eye tracking experiment that we did in the lab, and we transferred it to the MRI context. So participants would lie in the scanner, and via this mirror on the head coil, they could read the stories that were presented at the end of this bore. And with this camera, we could track the eye movements also via the mirror. And we have an infrared light source here. So in this way, we had information about the way participants would read, fixation onsets, which words were fixated, etc. And we had brain signal that was time locked to this this eye movement signal. So what we did was a fixation-related analysis, and the idea here is that when a neuron becomes active, when it's activated because it's perceiving a stimulus, for example, it will consume more oxygen, and oxygen has certain magnetic properties, and the MRI scanner can pick that changes in these magnetic properties can be picked up by the scanner. And what you get is a signal like this. So here we have a stimulus, and then this is what the scanner will pick up in the blood oxygenation level dependent signal. And then if we have a sequence of events, we will have a sequence of these waves. And if we put them together, we can predict a certain pattern that a neuron will have if it is receptive to these events. So you will get, for example, a prediction like this, and then an algorithm will go searching throughout the brain to find neurons that have a signal that is that looks a bit like this signal. And what we did was that we thought, okay, we can have real events, but we can also view words or fixations as events. So instead of an event onset and duration, we used a fixation onset and duration to calculate a prediction for this signal and search for it in the brain. And then again, we were not interested in just mere fixations, but we were also interested in if there was a difference between fixations on a motor description and a perceptual description, for example. So we use these ratings that I talked about before as weights for the words that could be fixated. So by adding all of these factors, we could build a model that predicted what our signal would look like in neurons that were, for example, specifically activated by motor descriptions. So what we found was these are the areas that are associated with motor descriptions, but not with other kinds of descriptions. And we see that indeed, as we expected, there are some motor areas, so domain-specific areas activated, but there are also some inferencing, event segmentation, situation model building areas activated. I don't have a clear and cut explanation for this. It could be that the process of event segmentation is mainly dependent on actions on motoric language. So for example, if we're trying to make sense of a stream of information by categorizing it into events, perhaps we do that mostly based on whether this, on actions and when the actions start and end, for example. But it could be that there's a completely different explanation for this. When looking at the perceptual descriptions, they were specifically associated with areas, visual modality-specific areas, so areas that have been implicated in visual simulation in earlier literature, and also areas in the ventral visual pathway. And then when we looked at mental event descriptions, we again saw modality-specific mentalizing areas that were associated with these mental event descriptions. And we also saw some language areas that were involved in or were activated by mental event descriptions. Again, this is a bit puzzling, but this close relationship between mentalizing and language processing has been described before. So it could be that mentalizing is highly dependent on linguistic cues. Then we also did an analysis where we looked at the overlap between the three kinds of simulation. So here we do not see areas that were activated by one specific kind of simulation, but here we allowed for overlap. So we looked at areas that were also activated by other kinds of simulation. And we see here the blue dots are motor descriptions, green dots are perceptual descriptions, and red dots are mental event descriptions. And here in the left supramarginal gyrus, we have an area where there's overlap between all three kinds of simulation. And this is an area that is involved in referential indexing and in the integration and the binding of reference into a context. It does this together with the angular gyrus that we that's functionally and spatially situated next to the supramarginal gyrus, and the angular gyrus is an area that we predicted from the beginning that could be a candidate for a one shared area for simulation. So this seems to be the case that there is indeed an area that is involved in simulation, and then in the context of the integration, the binding of reference into a context. Of course, we also looked at the eye tracking results. These are the results from our lab eye tracking study. And well, as you see, as you recall, motor descriptions were associated with faster reading, perceptual descriptions with slower reading, and mental event descriptions on average with slower reading, but with a bit more variation, especially between the stories. And here we used 3 stories, stories 1, 2, and 3. Stories 1 and 3 were reused in the fMRI experiment. So I called them 1 and 3 here as well. And what you see is that the results from the eye tracking part of this experiment were quite similar, even in a different set of participants in a completely different context. So that was interesting to see. So on the whole, we would say, okay, action seems to speed up reading times. Perceptual simulation mentalizing seems to slow down reading times. And we also see that action descriptions activate motor areas, perceptual descriptions, visual areas. So we see domain-specific activation that we would expect when we would look at simulation, mental simulation. So this descriptive language that we looked at in our studies do seem to be a marker for simulation. So simulation eliciting words, for example, or descriptions, passages. So to sum up, I would say, okay, eye tracking is a good way of measuring a complex process such as mental simulation, and we can really say something about this. And here we also saw that these theoretically distinctive types of simulation can also be shown when using eye tracking to study simulation. And this is something that is quite impossible to study with the, or at least very difficult to study with the offline self-report measures that are usually used for processes such as mental simulation. I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be here today also to answer your questions. But if there are questions about this presentation, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is right here. And I would also like to thank Willems and Faber, without whom I would never been able to do these studies. Thank you very much.